Presented by Caltech.
So the full foundations of machine learning and AI cannot possibly be covered in an hour. So in the interest of saying something focused, I decided to talk about adaptive experiment design, also known as active learning. In future AI for Science workshops, we'll cover other aspects of the foundations of machine learning and artificial intelligence. Raise of hands, who here knows what active learning is? Okay, so about half the audience. So the premise of this entire enterprise is goal-oriented experiment design. So we have a number of experiment platforms that are being developed across the sciences and engineering. These platforms are becoming increasingly automated and high throughput. And what that means is that the design of these experiments are becoming increasingly a software problem, or as I like to think of it, an AI problem. And so historically, on the left-hand side, you have the experiment designer, who is historically a human being, manually designing these experiments. Increasingly so, it's a tag team of a human and a software program where the human gives some high-level instructions and the software crunches away and designs an experiment. Increasingly so in the future, it'll be purely or almost entirely software-based, where the human only gives super high-level guidance and everything else will be taken care of by the software for a targeted experiment design. And so how it works is the experiment designer designs an experiment, runs it on the platform. We run the experiment, and we get a measurement, and then we repeat. That's the basic idea. And this cartoon caricature basically characterizes all manners of experiment design. One thing to keep in mind is that this process is iterative and adaptive. So the experiment that the algorithm will choose next is based on the outcomes of the previous experiment. So you need to replan on the fly. And furthermore, the goal is to maximize some utility. So while most of us, in its most ideal form, science is about discovering truth, I think it's fair to say that most of us care about science in the service of some relatively short-term goal, like maybe curing cancer. That's relatively short-term, let's say, or even more short-term than that. And so, in the service of such a relatively short-term goal, not all information is equally interesting. So we need to figure out how to collect information that's interesting and useful for our final objective. And so there are many applications that fit into this paradigm, ranging from things in robotics and control, where if you design a new robotic system, you want to automatically tune the controllers or design controllers for that system. That actually requires, in many cases, experiment design, where the control engineer has to actually tweak and test the controller, try it out, and see what doesn't work as well. Protein engineering, drug discovery, material science, and so on and so forth. And in fact, many of these activities are happening right here at Caltech, and I'll overview some of those activities later on in this talk. Here's a cartoon character that I like to give, especially for fundraising purposes, but I think you'll enjoy it. So some Caltech professor discovers some new phenomenon in nature, and after extensive experimentation, determines that this new phenomenon is statistically significant with 95% confidence, and writes a Nature paper, and we're super excited here at Caltech. Some larger organization, perhaps a pharmaceutical company, realizes that this Nature result is representative of a new hypothesis class of possibilities. And somewhere within this new hypothesis class of possibilities is a commercially useful result, let's say a new drug therapy. Unfortunately, the path from point A to point B is fraught with difficulties, setbacks, mistakes, possibly injuries or deaths. And increasingly so, the traversal from point A to point B is becoming expensive, longer, and just in general more inefficient. And it can cost hundreds of millions of dollars or even billions of dollars to make progress. And this, in some sense, is one of the core issues facing many areas of science and engineering today. And this is an area that I think AI for adaptive experiment design can help accelerate and reduce costs in. So the traditional view of machine learning that has been so commercially successful is called batch supervised learning. The basic idea is you have some raw data set of features or attributes, let's say movies on Amazon, where the attributes are who's acting in the movie, the genre, and so on and so forth. Then you have some target signal, let's say the ratings of this movie on Amazon. This huge data set gets crunched into a computer or a cloud of computers, and then you train a model, a classifier or regressor that tries to predict the movie ratings given its attributes. So this is what standard machine learning looks like. If you take my class, CS55, this is what we spend most of the class covering. The key thing I want you to notice in the context of this presentation is that all the data here is collected up front. So you have this huge data set that's been given to you that in Amazon or any other media service has been collecting for a long time. And so in the context of adaptive experiment design, that's often not the case, right? So in the extreme case, we have zero data collected up front. So all the data has to be collected on the fly. In many cases, because we're doing, let's say, prototype experiments or exploratory experiments, we have a very limited budget on how much data we can collect. In reality, we always have a limited budget, and in some cases more extreme than others. So in addition to doing proper supervised learning, one key question is how do we actually also endow the AI system with the ability to intelligently choose which data points to collect next? And that's the idea of interactive learning. And so from that perspective, there are three general classes of interactive learning. The first is called active learning, where the goal is to discover truth. For example, I'm a physicist, and I want to run experiments to discover some fundamental model of the universe. And my goal is to maximize accuracy of the predictions of this theory across some input domain. The second one is called optimization, most commonly Bayesian optimization, where the goal is to find the single best prediction. For example, in protein engineering, while I do care about the science of biochemistry, my ultimate goal for any particular engineering task is to design a protein that has maximal fitness. The only problem is I don't know what that fitness landscape is. I need to learn it from sampling. So the experiment design and fitting the fitness landscape is in the service of maximizing this fitness landscape. The last category is called multi-arm bandits, and its generalization is called reinforcement learning, where you care about utility over time. So, for example, the canonical application is a recommender system where you are running an experiment on real humans, typically, where you recommend them, let's say, a movie, and you observe their feedback, which is, did I like it, did I watch it, and so on and so forth. And so here the key difference is that we care about the utility of every experiment we run, not just the final utility at the end of time. Most of my research over the last 2 or 3 years, or a little bit longer than that, has been focused on the middle column, Bayesian optimization, which will be the topic of the majority of this talk. So here's the full learning setup. We have the experiment designer, so it's just a little bit more notation. We have an input space X, so the space of proteins that we're considering, the space of movies, and so on and so forth. We have an unknown fitness function, f of x equals y. And we're Bayesian in this particular framework, so we are maintaining a probability distribution over what the fitness landscape might look like. So I'll call that P of f given D, where D is the set of observations we made so far, initially empty. And so the experiment designer, at every time step, little t, chooses an action or an experiment. We run the experiment. We take a measurement. We update our probability distribution of what the fitness landscape might look like given this new measurement. This is known as posterior inference. And then we iterate using our new updated Bayesian model. And this setting is the canonical setting for Bayesian optimization and also multi-arm bandits and active learning, depending on your acquisition criteria of selecting experiments. And it has been studied actually since World War II, actually. There's a funny story that the proper design of experiment design was such a hard problem that the British wanted to throw that problem to the Nazis because they'll just kill themselves trying to solve it. We've made a lot of progress since then, of course, and there's been many algorithms designed for this problem over the last 70 years. Some of the more popular ones designed over the last 15 to 20 years include things like upper confidence bound and posterior sampling. So in this sort of very idealized and abstract form, this problem is very well studied. And so just to give a little bit more intuition about the nuances between the three different setups, let's just go through a very simple active learning example. Here we have one feature, and our goal is to learn a threshold function in this one feature. So the data is, there's no noise in the measurements. So passive learning, or supervised learning, we passively get data from this distribution, so uniformly, let's say. And the pluses and minuses are the labels. And then we fit a classifier. In this case, it's very trivial. We just sort of fit the classifier that's the midpoint between the two closest disagreeing data points. So this is, in this very cartoon example, standard supervised learning. And the true model is close to it, and we can talk about how close we are given how much data we have, generalization, using generalization bounds and concentration measures and stuff like that. In active learning, in this very simple example that's noise-free, the problem basically reduces to binary search in active learning. So we hypothesize that the true model may be the bisection of this input domain. We run an experiment, in this case, collect the label for this point, and we observe it's positive. And since we're in the noise-free case and separable case, we say we basically use this measurement to bisect the remaining unknown hypothesis space. And so now we hypothesize that the classifier is the bisection of the remaining uncertainty. We run an experiment, which means we collect the label, and we observe a negative label, and so on and so forth. And this process continues until you've exhausted some budget. And so what's interesting in this very simple example, and of course it can get much more complicated, is that in passive learning, if you want to be within epsilon of the true model, and you're just passively sampling data from the distribution, then you need about on the order of 1 over epsilon data points. In active learning, in this particular example, you need about on the order of log of 1 over epsilon data points. So what you see here is an exponential improvement in statistical efficiency of the learning if you're allowed to adaptively choose which data points to query. Of course, it gets much more complicated in more complicated scenarios, but I just wanted to sort of use this simple example to highlight the power of interactive learning. Bayesian optimization, at least here at Caltech, the canonical example is in protein engineering. So I stole this slide from Frances Arnold's website. Hope she doesn't mind. The basic idea is we have this unknown fitness landscape of proteins where fitness could be something like binding affinity, selective tropism, or whatever it is you're trying to use your protein to do. And you synthesize a protein, which means you generate an amino acid sequence, or actually you generate a DNA sequence that gets transcribed to an amino acid sequence. And then you grow that protein, and then you measure some property of this protein that gives you a data point about the fitness landscape, and then you rinse and repeat this process until you can identify the best possible protein within this landscape or a near optimal protein with this landscape. And you don't necessarily care about characterizing this fitness landscape exactly. You only care that you can find the optimal point. So for example, if I multiply this fitness landscape by a factor of 10, it doesn't change what the optimal solution is. So I could misestimate everything by a factor of 10, and it doesn't matter. Bandits, excuse me. So bandits are most commonly used for characterizing these types of settings where there's actually humans involved. So just to set the example, let's think about a clinical trial. So this is a super stylized, simplified examples, and there's a lot of complexities I'm just ignoring just to make a mathematical point. So please keep that in mind. In a canonical, conventional clinical trial, I view that as an instance of static experiment design. What that means is we have a pre-planned experimental design. Let's say a patient comes to the trial. We flip an unbiased coin, 50-50, and then we give this patient the treatment. The next patient comes to the clinical trial. We flip an unbiased coin, 50-50, and we give this patient the placebo or the control, and so on and so forth. And this is what I call a static experiment design. You can think of multi-arm bandits as a way of characterizing adaptive or sequential experiment design, where you adapt in this case, the biased coin, the coin, based on the outcomes of the previous experiments. So a patient comes to the trial. We flip initially an unbiased coin, 50-50, and we give this patient the treatment. In this super simplified example, let's say that we can observe the outcome of this treatment immediately. So we observe a positive outcome. Okay? The next patient comes, we flip a coin, we give this patient a control or placebo, and we can immediately observe an outcome, and let's say this outcome is negative. Next patient comes, we flip a coin, give a treatment, and then the patient gives a positive outcome. Observe a positive outcome. At this point, we have some information, not a lot, but a little bit of information that perhaps the treatment is more effective than the placebo. We have some confidence And if we can mathematically characterize what that confidence is, we can perhaps auto-tune this random coin to be slightly more biased towards giving the treatment and slightly less biased towards giving the control. And then if we can statistically correct for that bias in our inference later after running the experiments, then perhaps this is a better outcome overall for all the patients. So you can think of a static experiment design as saying, I want to maximize the power of this experiment design such that at the end of my clinical trial, I can recommend treatments to the entire population as reliably as possible, as statistically reliably as possible. In bandits and sequential experiment design, the idea is, wait a second. The people in the clinical trial matter too. Right? They matter as well. And if we think of a world, and we all live in this world with recommender systems, where we're constantly under an experiment design. If you ever use social media or ever use on e-commerce, you're constantly under an experiment design. Bandits are one of the principal technologies that drives computational advertising. You're constantly under an experiment design. Then if you think of our entire society is constantly under an experiment design, then this idea of doing adaptive experiment design makes a lot of sense. And this matters, right? So this is an excerpt from a New York Times article from about 7 or 8 years ago. These are two cousins. They were both afflicted with the same form of aggressive melanoma. And at that point in time, it was known by the doctors that the standard chemotherapy treatments were ineffective. They just knew. And there was a promising drug at that time under clinical trial. And they were doing the standard static clinical trial. And so one of these two people got the control, which is ineffective chemotherapy, and the other one got the treatment. One of these people died within a few weeks. The other one lived, fairly healthfully for an extra 6 months. So, these ideas matter. Now, of course, I am dramatically oversimplifying this setting. There's a lot of complications and that I'm completely ignoring, but I just want to make this mathematical point. So, just to summarize the basic settings. So we have 3 basic settings for interactive learning. They're called active learning, optimization, often Bayesian optimization, and bandits, which is a special case of reinforcement learning. They're very similar in their structure, certainly in their interaction protocol. So they have they have the exact same interaction protocol. The only difference is how they prioritize which data points or which experiments to conduct. In active learning, the goal is to discover some notion of universal truth. So I want to learn f of x as accurately as possible across the entire input domain. In Bayesian optimization, the goal is to find the maximizer of this unknown fitness function, capital F. And my goal of learning capital F is only in the service of finding the maximizer. In multi-arm bandits, I want to maximize the utility of every experiment that I run over the entire course of the experiment design. And this is commonly used for characterizing recommender systems that have actual people in them. And this is also known in the literature as cumulative regret minimization, if you need keywords to search for on Google. So that's the basic comparison. Now, in my group, we do a lot of research in learning theory and algorithmic design. And so while I'm very excited to collaborate with so many brilliant scientists and engineers here at Caltech and see these algorithms come to life in those applications, for my core research group and my PhD students, we also are very interested in understanding what are the new mathematical structures and properties that underlie these new applications such that we can exploit them to design more scalable and more effective algorithms. So we tend to ask these types of questions when we write machine learning papers, things like analyzing convergence to the maximizer. Can we provably guarantee side constraints are satisfied during experiment design, for example, safety? How do we deal with, in a mathematically principled way, corrupted or indirect measurements? How do we efficiently search through large design spaces? So for example, in protein engineering, the design space is combinatorial, which means that even computing the optimal experiment to run in one time step might be more expensive than actually running the experiment if you're not careful. And how do we mathematically incorporate domain knowledge in a principled way to provably speed up learning? So we don't have to relearn, let's say, force equals mass times acceleration, or what is the standard aerodynamic drag on a drone, or what is the gravity coefficient. These are things you do not need to learn. And can we incorporate these in a mathematically principled way with standard learning? And so for the remainder of this presentation, I will just walk you through a few applications that my group has been collaborating with across Caltech. And so I'll start with the first one. And I dubbed this topic real-world Bayesian optimization. And so let me start with a motivating application. This is in collaboration with Joel Burdick, who is a faculty in MCE. And Joel has been working for a long time with spinal cord injury patients. So this particular subject, he fell or he injured his spine, and he basically exhibits complete lower limb paralysis, so he's a paraplegic. What Joel has been working on in collaboration with various medical schools is using this epidural electrostimulator, which is basically, in this case, it's a Medtronic array. And this stimulator is implanted inside the spinal column, close to the spinal cord, and it induces an electromagnetic field to help this patient regain some lower limb mobility. The neuroscience of this is completely beyond me, so I'm very grateful to have Joel as a bridge to help me understand and abstract away this problem. The main challenge here is that every patient is unique. Their physiology is unique, their injury is unique, there's even variability in where you implant the device. And even a modest discretization of the stimuli that this device can give can lead to over 1 billion possible treatments or therapies. Raise of hands, how many people here have done physical therapy? Okay, a fair amount. So I've also done physical therapy, and it sometimes seems like the therapist is just trying things at random and hoping one of them will be effective. A few people are smiling, good. And so in this particular case, the therapists, the doctors, have a very strong high-level intuition, knowing that this neuromodulation can, in principle, stimulate a recovery of lower limb mobility. But in terms of the fine-grained micro-optimizations needed to actually do this well for each individual patient, their intuition completely falls apart. And that's where this connection of this, this hypothesis space with this high-level idea and the micro-optimization needed to do this efficiently to reach a useful result comes into play. And so here's the learning setup. We have this electrode array powered by software, AI software. We run it, we apply stimulus. We observe how well the patient's standing. We update our posterior of what the fitness function, and we repeat. That's the basic idea. So just what I described before, but now projected onto this application. There are many challenges when extending the vanilla version of Bayesian optimization to this real-world problem. The first one is that there are many actions, up to 1 billion, sometimes more. Actually, a lot. It can be a lot more. Measuring utility is difficult. So for a while, what we still do, is we ask the doctors how well this patient is standing. And as you can imagine, that's a very subjective thing, and the doctors don't always agree. And in fact, the doctors are not even consistent, internally consistent across time. They will contradict themselves the next day or the next hour. And of course, safety matters. These are real human subjects, and we need to make sure that we are conducting experiments in a way that does not cause undue discomfort or even pain. And so the way we address the first challenge is to use a method called Gaussian processes. For those of you who have not seen Gaussian processes, it's completely specified by a mean function and a covariance function. And so it's a Gaussian process. A process is a distribution over functions, just like rather than a distribution over a random variable. So you sample a function from a Gaussian process. Let's call that function f. The expected value of f of x for any input x is exactly the mean function, mu of x. The covariance or correlation between any two pairs of inputs, x1 and x2, is exactly the kernel function, k of x1, x2. In the case where x is just a discrete choice of, let's say, 10 different values, then this exactly reduces to a multivariate Gaussian distribution. So you can roughly think of a Gaussian process as an infinite dimensional generalization of a multivariate Gaussian distribution. So that's what we use to build these correlations. And so why do we use Gaussian processes? Well, one of the biggest benefits is that it gives us a handle about reasoning about uncertainty. So we can now do posterior inference and reason about the spread of possible outcomes for any particular experiment. We can model low-dimensional correlations over the input space. So for example, if we build a kernel that's low-dimensional, much lower dimensional than, let's say, 1 billion, then we can say something like, okay, if we take a measurement at x1, which is a particular experiment or stimulus, whatever we measure there gives us information about what f of x2 is. And so that dramatically reduces the dimensionality of the experiment design. And in fact, if you really wanted to, you could work with domain experts to carefully build these correlation functions using domain knowledge. So for example, you can work with a neuroscientist to simulate how these different electric fields permeate the soft and hard tissues so that you can tell that, okay, I don't know if this particular treatment will be effective for this patient, but I know that these two treatments permeate the soft and hard tissue in similar ways, so they're likely to have similar outcomes, which means I don't have to run both. And that's how we reduce the dimensionality of the problem. Measuring utility is difficult. So what we do is we use preference elicitation. So the basic idea here is that rather than asking a doctor to rate how well this patient is standing on a 1 to 10 scale, we ask the doctor, okay, let's say given 2 stimuli, which stimuli is better than the other? Which stimulus is better than the other? I hate that word, by the way. It always confuses me. So that's the basic idea. And this has been shown across a range of applications to be much more reliable in terms of getting feedback that's subjective than actually asking absolute values. And in particular, during my PhD at Cornell, I worked on this type of research in the context of search engines, where if you have 2 ranking functions returning search results, what you can do is you can interleave their search results into interleaving of them, so they're color-coded here. You present this interleaved search result to a user. You observe the user's clicks, which you can think of as subjective feedback, and now the clicks correspond to which ranking function is better than the other one. We've deployed interleaving on every major search engine. This particular experiment was done on Yahoo, back when they had a search engine. I probably shouldn't say that, it's being recorded. Anyway, so in this particular case, it was an online experiment with 2 ranking functions, and lower is better in terms of determining which one's better, which ranking function is better than the other one. And in this particular case, we had ground truth. And so the black ones are absolute metrics, like clicks at rank 1. So these are like doctors saying this is good, this is bad. And then interleaving is the red line. And the things I want you to notice is that interleaving is more sensitive. In this particular experiment, it's about 100 times more statistically sensitive than measuring absolute feedback. And it's also more reliable. Sometimes these absolute metrics, they're not actually consistent with what's truly better. And okay, back to our application in spinal cord therapy. So we're going to measure utility using preference elicitation. Finally, safety. So in this particular application, we're also going to model safety using a Gaussian process. And so here I'm showing just the Gaussian process in a 1D space where the the true function is the bold line, and the uncertainty confidence intervals where we think the function might be are in the shaded regions. And that dotted horizontal line is our safety threshold. If we ever run an experiment where the safety function value is below that threshold, it is considered unsafe, and we never want to do that. And so here's how we can use this idea to reason about safety. So if because this is a 1D design space, we can, all the designs are on the 1D plane, 1D line. So if we pick the design that intersects the red vertical line, that's unsafe according to this model because the shaded region intersects with the horizontal line. So it's potentially unsafe. If we pick the blue line, the point intersecting with the blue vertical line, we know that's safe with high probability because the shaded region is very far from the dotted line. If we pick the purple line, if we take the point corresponding to the purple line, it's almost unsafe. So our shaded region is still doesn't intersect with the dotted line, but the lower bound on what the safety value might be is very, very close. So this is the sort of the high level ideas we use to build our algorithms. So uncertainty quantification using Gaussian processes. So here's the full learning setup. We apply multiple stimuli while guaranteeing safety, receive a preference response, and repeat. And I'm just going to give you a cartoon overview of the algorithm. So we assume that we have an initial safe action, and because our kernel function of the Gaussian process is smooth, we have an initial safe region. And this is very easy to do in spinal cord therapy. You just set the voltage very low. We know it's safe. And so what the algorithm does is it first explores the safety region. So it queries an experiment close to the safety threshold, and it observes the actual safety value. And in this case, it's actually very safe. So we can expand the safety region. We query another point close to the safety boundary. according to our uncertainty. And we measured the actual safety value. And now we observed, oh, it's actually really close to the safety boundary. So it's actually almost unsafe. So we try some other place. And this process continues until we've maximally expanded the reachable safety region from our initial safe action. At this point, we could run any standard Bayesian optimization algorithm that's been developed over the last 30 years as a subroutine. That's the basic idea. So first, maximize the safety region, and we have an algorithmic design for that we developed in our paper, that with theoretical guarantees on convergence. And then this meta framework reduces to any standard Bayesian optimization algorithm that you want, and we can inherit any convergence guarantees of the more classical Bayesian optimization algorithm as a subroutine. That's the basic idea. And so here's a demonstration of the experiment. Of this algorithm. So this particular patient had been paralyzed for over 2 years, and this is him standing, I believe, for the first time with the help of this stimulation. And this is, of course, joint work with a lot of people through Joel Burdick's, led by Joel Burdick. And we can do quantitative experiments as well. I won't talk about this too much. The blue lines are the experiments that we ran. The green line is the best possible setting found manually by a physician, and the orange line is sort of a smoothing out of the blue line. And Joel Burdick took a look at this plot, and he interpreted this as this algorithm is doing about 40% better than the best human treatments for this particular task. Okay, I'm going to move on a little bit faster, so I'm just going to run through a few more examples. The next one, I'll just start with the motivating application. This is in collaboration with Harry Atwater's group, who is in applied physics here at Caltech in nanophotonic structure design. And so the basic idea is we're going to design these filters, which are essentially camera sensors. And so these filters in this particular case is specified by things like the mirror height, the slit width, the oxide thickness, and the mirror spacing. And what this thing basically is it's a photon well. It traps a photon, and then the slit filters out everything but a specific wavelength of light. And so what wavelength gets filtered in and what the SNR ratio is, it depends on the specific parameterization of this structure family. And you could put many of these with that filter for many different wavelengths of light and put it into a superpixel and have a really powerful camera. The primary application of this, if you're interested, is hyperspectral imaging. So you can put these things on a satellite and take and have these very narrowband filters and take images of, let's say, the Earth, and then you could actually analyze compositional properties of various parts of the ground by using these very narrowband filters. So here's an example of a narrowband filter. So that plot you see there is the transmission filtering spectrum across different wavelengths. So on the cameras on your phone, they're very diffuse filters, RGB. This is very narrowband with a lot of interesting applications. And so how we actually set up this problem is you can actually exactly compute this transmission spectrum by solving Maxwell's equations. So in this particular case, because everything is at a nanoscale, you can actually simulate everything from first principles. And so you specify an instantiation of this family, structure family. You run an experiment, in this case solving Maxwell's equations. And you compute this transmission spectrum, and then you have some fitness function that depends on the selectivity of the wavelength in question, the SNR, and so on and so forth. And that's the equation at the bottom that's been around for a while in the applied physics community. Now the challenge that came up when we started talking with Harry's group is that in many real world cases, solving Maxwell's equations to high fidelity is extremely expensive. It can take weeks to run one simulation for some of the more complicated structures. And so in this 2D case, we have actually 3 different fidelities, one at the 1 nanometer fidelity up to the 3 nanometer fidelity. So the one on the right is much coarser than the one on the left. And in this 2D case, the one on the right is about 9 times cheaper to solve than the one on the left. In the 3D case, it's 27 times cheaper to solve. Of course, it's not going to give you as accurate of a result, but it is much, much cheaper. And the fundamental question that sparked this research project was, do we need to accurately simulate crappy structures? If we simulate one of these structures on the cheaper fidelities and it's already really bad, what's the likelihood it's going to be good if you simulate it well? And so you could characterize this by saying every fidelity has a separate Gaussian process fitness function. They're correlated in some way, We don't know exactly what that correlation is, but we can run experiments to calibrate these across these different fidelities. And that's basically how the learning setup is. We have this structure, a family of structures. Our AI algorithm chooses an instantiation. We run an experiment. We also choose a fidelity level. We get a measurement back. We update our posterior, and we rinse and repeat. And so I'll again give you just a cartoon of the algorithmic design principles. So what we do first is we run a few experiments where we run both at the coarse and fine levels. Here I'm just showing 2 fidelity levels for simplicity. This algorithm generalizes to arbitrarily finite numbers of fidelity levels. What this allows you to do is it allows you to compute a calibration across the fitness functions. So I know that so I have some information about how these 2 fitness functions are calibrated. And now I'm going to exploit this information by mostly running coarse simulations, occasionally running fine-grained simulations to further my calibration. But what this coarse-grained simulations do is, given the calibration, the confidence I have in the calibration, I can quickly eliminate large subsections of the hypothesis space as clearly not optimal. And after I've eliminated all those spaces, in the remaining space, I only run the fine-grained simulation to identify the optimal solution. So that's the basic idea. And again, this is a meta framework. So we use the coarse level as much as possible. We periodically check the fine level to calibrate further, and there's a scheduling to do that that's justified from information theory. And then we switch to the fine level at the end with a very restricted hypothesis space. And here, again, you can use any Bayesian optimization algorithm you want. So this is, again, a meta framework, and we inherit all the theoretical convergence guarantees of the subroutine. And the way you tie this all together, and if you're interested, you can read our paper for details, is we develop a new notion of cost-weighted value of information across these different fidelity levels in order to design an end-to-end fully automatable algorithm that can make intelligent decisions in this case. And so here's just one plot that I'm showing you. So in this particular case, there are 3 fidelity levels, and our algorithm is the one in red. So here, lower is better. So in the beginning, our algorithm is doing a bunch of calibration across fidelity levels and shaving off suboptimal regions of the hypothesis space. So it's not doing very well in terms of the best possible structure it's found so far. But then it reaches this phase transition where it quickly narrows in on the likely optimal subspace of the hypothesis space, and it starts performing really well. And indeed, this algorithm, as far as we know, is state-of-the-art in this particular domain of photonic structure design. And we're working actively with Harry's group to develop a robust and broadly useful software that can be disseminated across the community. I'm just going to go through a few more very quickly. The next one is in combinatorial experiment design. So in an application like protein engineering, there's a particular form of protein engineering design called site saturation mutagenesis. And what site saturation mutagenesis, sorry, I don't say these words often. Frances probably just rolls off her tongue, right? What site saturation mutagenesis is you pick a few sites in your amino acid chain to mutate, and then in full saturation, you will mutate all of the 20 variants. In partial saturation, you mutate a subset of the variants. And there are a few things that are interesting about this problem from the perspective of the mathematical framework I described at the beginning of the talk, which is first, we are running a batch of experiments, like 100, 200, maybe even 1,000 or a few thousand, rather than one at a time. So you actually have to choose a set of experiments to run. And 2, your experiment design is actually stochastic. You cannot completely control what experiments you run, because you can only specify a distribution, and then the bacteria, or typically bacteria, they'll just grow whatever proteins they want to grow, hopefully with a distribution that matches the distribution you specified. And so there's a lot of randomness here. And so hence the term batched stochastic Bayesian optimization. How do we simultaneously deal with the fact that we cannot select our experiments deterministically, and that we need to select a combinatorial library at a time? I'm not going to go through any of the details, but Kevin, who was a PhD student with Frances, did a lot of work with us in understanding the theory of this problem, and we were able to develop algorithms that performed really well in some simulated experiment design settings where we actually knew the ground truth, where we, in about 3 rounds of experimentation, we're able to discover a very high-performing protein. And there's many more. So I spent a lot of time talking about Bayesian optimization, but these optimization problems need not be inherently Bayesian. And we can also do things like incorporate physics as domain knowledge to, in some cases, provably speed up learning. So one obvious applications of this is in interactive controller calibration. So I do a lot of work on, or I do some work on understanding how machine learning can be applied to things like 3D printers, also known as additive manufacturing. And the basic idea is this. So let's say we design a new 3D printer. What typically happens is a bunch of control engineers have to carefully tune the controllers of this printer. So this particular printer is a laser inkjet printer, so like the ones you have in 2D, but much more complicated. So there's a powder bed of materials. A laser shines across that powder bed. The material in the powder bed melts, deforms, congeals, and then as it's deforming and congealing, stuff happens, and you get out a nice 3D object. And in order for that to be super precise and accurate, you need to know a lot about the thermodynamics of the material that you're heating. If you're off in your thermodynamics model, you're not going to be able to print with high precision. You may be only print with coarse precision. So in order to develop really precise and well-calibrated 3D printers and machinery like 3D printers, we need to do so efficiently. We need to do interactive controller calibration. Other applications include things like controller calibrations of things like drones. For example, if you want to teach a drone to, if you want to calibrate a drone controller to automatically calibrate a drone controller to interact with a boundary condition, like let's say the ground, what you would do typically is you would have to babysit that process. And in the first version of these projects, we did that where we manually collected the data. But more generally, you want the AI algorithm to actually drive the data collection and do the interactive calibration on its own in an automated way. And so here's just one result. This is work done by Angie, where we were actually doing this interactive drone calibration of learning to interact with a boundary condition using non-Bayesian optimization, in this particular case, robust neural nets, and we got pretty nice results. The next thing that I'll just quickly talk about is dynamical systems. So the first project I talked about was just about standing. You may also want to help the patient do something dynamical like walking. And so in that context, we've been working with Aaron Ames's group with these exoskeletons where we want to do preference elicitation not just for standing, but also for some sort of dynamic motion like walking. And so this is work primarily by two students, Megan Tucker and Ellen Novoseller. And it's the high-level idea is basically the same, and I won't go into the details. If you're interested in the details, they're in the two papers below. And I'll just show you a video. So that's Megan, and where the AI algorithm is doing adaptive experimentation to tune the gait to maximize her comfort level. Okay, the last thing I'll quickly mention is human cognitive factors. So this is particularly relevant in things like tutoring systems, where let's say we're building a tutoring system for a citizen science application. This is like the one you see on the left, where there's a birder who's really passionate about birding, but has trouble recognizing or discriminating between two species of closely related birds. Let's say the Connecticut warbler and the McGillivray's warbler. In fact, I have a hard time discriminating between the two. One of the things that we realized is that humans learn not just from examples, right? This is X, this is Y, but we learn from explanations. This is X because of Z. And one way to sort of formalize that in this particular tutoring application is to give visual cues. The reason why these two birds are different species is because of the feather coloring around the eyes. And if you can help the human zero in on that, then the human can, in principle, learn a lot faster, and indeed we found that to be the case. We also looked at things like forgetfulness. So humans are not like computers. We forget all the time. And tutoring systems realize this, and they do things like spaced repetition, where they reinforce your memory by offering you lessons in spaced intervals. So for example, if you ever use Duolingo, they use spaced repetition. And we've done quite a bit of work understanding how to actually do smart spaced repetition across a wide range of concepts to maximize retention across a wide range of concepts. And so if you're interested in these topics, the papers are below. Okay, just to summarize, what I've talked to you about today is one pillar of the foundations of AI. There are many, and we'll cover more in future workshops. And this particular pillar is in active learning or adaptive experiment design. And it's motivated by the fact that experimental platforms are increasingly automated or automatable. They're higher throughput. They're connected to software. The software can completely drive, or the software is increasingly able to drive more and more of the experiment design, where the human designer is just applying ever higher level feedback, and more of it's being automatable. And this motivates using formulations like active learning, Bayesian optimization, and multi-arm bandits to characterize this automated experiment design problem. Now, of course, these interactive learning paradigms have been studied for a long time, and they're actually, in their simplified form, fairly theoretically well understood. Of course, when you scale them up to real-world problems, there are many new challenges that are introduced. And what's interesting to me as a machine learning researcher is studying how to theoretically characterize these new challenges and design algorithms that can leverage the structure of these problems to scale it to real-world problems. So things including, how do we deal with indirect measurements? How do we run experiments that satisfy constraints such as safety? And how do we integrate in a principled way domain knowledge to provably achieve higher performance? And of course, one of the reasons why I'm here at Caltech is because I have so many cool collaborations with people such as yourselves in such a wide range of scientific and engineering, science and engineering domains. And finally, I like to give a shout out to the collaborators, especially the students and the postdocs in the top row. It should come as no surprise that they actually did all the work, and I'm just here talking about it. For those of you who are undergrads, I like to point to the person on the top left. Her name is Alicia. She's a junior. She contributed to some of this research, and who knows, maybe your face can be on this next version of these slides. Thank you for your attention. Yeah. Questions? Yeah. Okay, so the question is about what are some of the success stories of how to best to incorporate domain knowledge to speed up learning. So there's some vanilla answers that are not specific to my research. That one is, can I reduce the dimensionality of the design space? So rather than a 10-dimensional problem, I know some tricks and I can reduce it to a 2-dimensional problem. Of course, that helps, and that's not unique to anything I do. That's just a generic thing. The other one is, do I have an idea of what might be a good starting point? So in generic Bayesian optimization, the convergence of learning is characterized by two properties. One is the dimensionality of the design space, and two is the radius the radius of the design space. So if I have prior knowledge of where the optimal solution might be, the radius is smaller. If I can reduce the degrees of freedom, the dimensionality is smaller. And those two factors actually interact multiplicatively. So if you can do both, they're actually much better. More specific to my research, the most interesting forms of domain knowledge has actually been in situations where there's perhaps a discontinuity in the experiment design. So for example, in the drone landing, if I crash the drone, that's not good. So I never want to do that. And so you can think of that as a sharp discontinuity in the experiment design. And that's something that's not really well studied in the conventional active learning paradigm. And so those are new things that myself and a few other labs around the world are really focused on. And other things like in the human factors, right? We actually changed the output space. Instead of recommending an image with a label of a bird, we recommended an image, a label of the bird, and where you should focus your attention to understand why this label exists. So we actually completely changed the output space. So I gave you two answers: the generic answers, and then it's sort of more interesting, in my opinion, interesting answers to actually characterize interesting real-world structure.
Whenever you do the adaptive step, retraining for the adaptive step, landscape, do you ever incorporate these physical constraints in the actual training?
Okay, so the question is, do we incorporate physical constraints into the actual training? So the answer is yes and no. So one of the most common ways to incorporate blend with physics is to do what's called residual modeling. So the physics models something, but the physics is inaccurate, so there's some residual that's unmodeled, and the learning just models the residual. So in that case, the answer is yes and no, because on the one hand, yes, we're only learning the residual. On the other hand, it's just nicely additively separated. There are other cases where it's more interesting, where you actually need to incorporate with physics in a more integrated way, and those often happen in sequential cases. So if your experiment, like in your case, is happens over multiple time steps, where one experiment, that the result of your experiment is actually, let's say, phase transitions between fluids and solids and crystallization over multiple time steps, then the learning and the physics get intertwined over time because it's integrated into some sort of like ODE or PDE. So that becomes much more interesting. That's something I'm very interested in exploring further in the future. Yes?
So when you apply Bayesian optimization on the spinal cord population, so intrinsically Bayesian optimization is assuming that things are closed or correlated. But what happens if the geometry underneath is more complicated? And the spinal cord is periodic, maybe the end of the spinal cord is actually more correlated with the head, things like that.
Okay, so the question is, in Bayesian optimization, we assume that our correlation function is good. What happens if it's not good? So like all things in statistics and data science and machine learning, there's no free lunch. If your assumptions about the world is wrong, then you need to do one of two things. One, live with it, in which case you get the wrong answer. Or two, make fewer assumptions, in which case learning is much slower. So that's the generic answer. Specific to the spinal cord case, what you do, I mean, so there's sort of three levels of answers, and I think I only have time to give two in the interest of time. One is, it's actually a social problem. Science is a social enterprise. So you can work to educate the neuroscientists about the strengths and limitations of your approach and ask them, does this kernel function make sense? Does this kernel function actually characterize at a rough level the correlations you would expect to model for your application? And you can educate them. And I do that a lot, not just with neuroscientists, but with other scientists as well. And so if they're properly educated about the strengths and limitations of these methods, then they can work with you to make sure that these assumptions are valid. The second one is perhaps more interesting to me as a long-term research objective, is how do we do this in a more automatic and generic way with making fewer assumptions? So you mentioned things like periodic. So people design periodic kernels. So there's Max Welling, who's a professor at University of Amsterdam. He had a paper last year on periodic kernels, where the kernel is cylindrical in some sense, right? So, if you believe, but there's a push and pull. So the domain expert thinks that you need a kernel that has some property X. Let's say X is periodicity. Then the machine learning person says, okay, let's design a kernel that's periodic. That's a better fit for your domain knowledge. And so that's a push and pull. If there's one last question, I can take it. Otherwise, I think we're out of time. Okay, thank you.